Okay, Ling 341. We've just got a few notes on nasal acoustics to work through today, so let's get after it. Yeah, we've talked a little bit about nasals already. At least we know how to transcribe them. Phonologically speaking, you say nasals are sonorants that have the greatest amount of constriction in the vocal tract because actually they have a complete occlusion in the vocal tract because you are lowering your velopharyngeal port, your soft velum, so that air can go through your nose, but you close your oral tract completely so that air gets stopped up in your mouth somewhere. So that makes nasals a stop in your mouth, but it's still more or less like a vowel if the air is going through your nose. So for this reason, because air can still flow freely through your nose, air pressure is not going to build up behind that stop constriction in any meaningful way, and voicing won't be impeded at the glottis. So we don't get a meaningful change in the sort of differential between air pressure above and below the glottis based on air pressure getting stopped, or the airflow getting stopped in your mouth as it is. So just so we can get a sense of what this looks like, I can go back to the X-ray video. We've seen this before, but this is the Ken Stevens production. And so one of the things I wanted to point out here is that normally when you are just sitting around doing nothing, not speaking or what have you, your velum is hanging down here. So actually maybe, yeah, he has his mouth closed at this point and his velum is down. So this is what it looks like when you're just normally sitting around and breathing through your nose, not through your mouth. You leave that passageway open so that you can still get the air in and out from the outside world into your lungs. And as he gets ready to speak, he kind of will lift that up and close off that passageway. And that's what's called the speech ready position. So one of the things you have to do to begin to speak is actively move something without making any noise, and what you move is that soft palate. And there's an interesting little sequence here where he says hadeh and haneh. And so when he says hadeh, he raises his soft velum all the way up so that it makes a closure here and air just flows through the mouth. When he says haneh, he actually raises it up a little bit and cuts off the flow of air somewhat, but still closes the passageway through the mouth so that air will continue to go through the nose. So there's a little bit of motion going on there that doesn't really have any acoustic consequences, but it's part of how you actually get ready to speak and how you actually produce these things. So just so you know, like I said, we've talked about how to transcribe nasals and noted that basically anywhere you can produce an oral stop, you can produce a nasal stop as well. There's this language Yanua, an Australian language, which has all of the various different places of articulations for stops, for nasals, has almost all of the nasal stops, except for, as I'm looking at this, it doesn't have the uvular one way back here. But we can walk through these. There's a bilabial. Try that again. There's a dental nasal. There's an alveolar nasal. A retroflex nasal, which you might remember from the first production exercise. There's kind of a post-alveolar nasal, which sounds a bit like a palatal. And what's labeled here is a front velar with a angma with a little plus diacritic underneath it, and a back velar with sort of retracted diacritic underneath the velar nasal. Sorry, I keep doing that. Okay, we'll go through all these just by themselves. Okay, so in addition to that, there's also one more symbol we haven't talked about. I think I might have mentioned it at some point. But you can also get a nasal stop at one place of articulation where the oral stops will never occur. That's the labial dental stop. So this kind of uses a similar notation to angma, except where it has this kind of descender on the right-hand side of the symbol, but it's attaching it to an M rather than an N. So this is basically, rather than saying a labiodental fricative like F or V, you make the same kind of closure, curling your lower lip underneath your teeth, and then you make a nasal, like that, ma, rather than ma. And it's hard to hear the difference between those two. We can listen to how Peter Latifoga does it.
Amma.
Kind of sounds a little bit like he's smiling as he produces this labiodental, because he kind of ma. Maybe he's trying to make it clear, but you kind of have to spread your lips a bit to do that.
Amma.
To get that labiodental nasal. So M might occur allophonically in English in words where you have an M followed by a labiodental fricative, like dumbfounded, or comfort. And I think where I talked about this previously was discussing the word bamf. In theory, you might have a labiodental nasal here replacing the N, bamf. But that would be a little bit tricky because you'd be getting rid of your alveolar closure for the N there if you are anticipating one, and replacing it with something, a combination of closure with your lips and your teeth. So maybe you have a labiodental nasal there, but what's probably more likely is you just don't have a nasal stop at all, and you just nasalize the vowel like bamf. Yeah, and apparently this also occurs allophonically in a couple Romance languages like Catalan, inferme, or I don't know exactly, infermer, Italian, invece, so on and so forth. Anywhere you're getting kind of a nasal butting up against a labiodental fricative, this is a possibility. So one thing I'll note here is that, like I said, we can't get an oral stop at this place of articulation, because if you try to make a stop between your lips and your teeth, you just can't get a good enough seal to make it not be a fricative. But you can do it with nasal, because effectively shifting some of the airflow through your nose will kind of prevent frication from happening, or too much frication from happening at your lips and your teeth, so you can't hear that turbulence that would sort of make it a nasal fricative rather than a nasal stop. Yeah, so that's one issue that nasals have, is that the air flowing through the nose kind of reduces the amount of airflow through your oral tract, and makes it such that it's hard to actually produce a nasal fricative at all. For the record, there are no basically uncontroversial nasal fricatives in the languages of the world. There are some languages which claim they exist, and they're articulatorily possible. There's no real reason why it shouldn't be a problem to produce that combination of gestures with your articulators, but the aerodynamics makes them difficult to sort of produce with the appropriate acoustics that you might want to have, and also for the listener to pick up what you're trying to do. So instead of nasalized fricatives or nasal fricatives, what we do actually get in language is, or in a few languages, are voiceless nasals, which are kind of like nasal fricatives, because they're kind of like nasalizing, say, a glottal fricative or what have you, with a different sort of place of articulation in the oral tract. So I've got some examples here from Burmese. Burmese is a tone language, and it has four different stop places of four different nasal places of articulation. So these should all be familiar by now, but
Na.
The bilabial, the dental,
Na.
palatal,
Ya.
and a velar.
Ya.
And what's a little bit unusual here is that, say, we don't get the velar nasal in onset position, but they do in Burmese.
Ya.
And what they also get in Burmese are voiceless versions of all of these. So if you're producing these, you're basically just breathing through your nose, or so on and so forth. And I guess I probably misspoke before when I was saying it's maybe like a glottal fricative, because it's more like you're producing turbulence noise at sort of the opening of your nostrils rather than at the glottis. So set that comment aside. The important point is that you're not producing voicing at the vocal folds at all, but you are able to change the place of articulation, and evidently it works well enough such that listeners of Burmese or learners of Burmese can pick up the differences in the place of articulation. So let's try these, or you can try them at home. Again, these can be a little bit dangerous because you're just breathing voicelessly through your nose in an audible way.
Ma. Na. Ya. Ya.
And I'll point out here this notation as well. So normally when we have a voiceless segment, we put this little circle underneath the segment here. But because there's a descender in terms of both the palatal and velar symbols for nasal stops, it kind of gets in the way of that notation. So it's okay to put the little voiceless symbol on the top and still figure out what is being meant by that combination of symbols in the IPA.
Ma, na, nya, nya.
Right. So hopefully that's clear enough. There's also the possibility to get voiced versus breathy voiced nasals. And so this is a language called Newari, which is spoken in Nepal, which is basically right next door to Burma. So maybe this is kind of an aerial feature in language. But this is a voice quality contrast again. So we've got modal voiced nasal stops
Ma,
and breathy voiced nasal stops.
ma,
I'll walk you through all three of these, and then I'll play all the breathy ones after.
ma, na, na,
And as you can see, there's a vowel length distinction here too.
ma, na, na,
So I think these work out pretty nicely.
na, na,
And you might also notice with this one,
ma,
there's kind of a dip in F0 he gets right after he produces this breathy voiced nasal that you don't hear for the modal voiced one.
ma, ma.
Yeah. So also, right, you can conceive of sort of transcribing these breathy voiced ones with like an M and like a superscripted breathy H, perhaps. But they're transcribed here with this breathy voiced diacritic, just underneath, in this case, a nasal stop, rather than putting it underneath a vowel. Okay, so nasal acoustics are quite complex. However, normally nasals are pretty easy to spot in a spectrogram. They have a very distinctive pattern. It's just kind of hard to tell one nasal stop from the other. So here's what you should look for if you encounter these things in a spectrogram. So first of all, they're going to look basically like vowels, because what I said about you basically producing a vowel through your nose is true. You're just kind of blocking off the passageway through your mouth, which makes it a little more complicated. But if you just took the passageway through your nose alone, you would basically be getting like a vowel with a slightly longer tube than you get through your mouth. And also there's kind of permanent lip rounding because your nostrils are rounded at the far end. So the formants will be low, especially the first formant will be lower. And because you're getting that lip rounding, that kind of tight closure at the end of the tube, the overall amplitude is going to be lower than in vowels. All the nasals we're going to see in the spectrograms we'll check out in this class are going to be voiced, because I'm just going to show you English and not Burmese. So you're going to see periodic voicing, so those glottal pulses all the way through. Also, because of basically energy getting sucked out of the airflow as it kind of gets trapped in the mouth, when you produce the nasals, these higher formants are going to have low intensity when we see nasals in spectrograms. And for the same reason, the formants that we do see are going to have broad bandwidths. So the frequency range of the dark bar is going to be spread out and also kind of flattened, so it's not as prominent in the spectrogram. So I'm going to walk you through why we get each one of these acoustic characteristics in turn. Here's what it looks like when you have decreased overall amplitude. So for ma, obviously you're going to get more amplitude, more airflow coming out of your mouth and your nose combined when you have an ah. And then it's going to decrease with the because it's not as possible to get the nose as open as you can get your mouth for an ah. And this is what it looks like in waveform view. So you can see the greater amplitude of the waveform for the vowels. And for the spectrogram view, same production. Here's our nice ahs here. And then we get an in the middle, where we're losing a lot of intensity right in the middle of this. And the formants are kind of getting sucked out, especially at the higher levels. Like I said, we have a very low first frequency formant here. Then everything else above that is just faded out effectively. Okay, why is it faded out? Another issue with nasals is that we get what is called damping when we produce them. And this is, in a sense, sort of the opposite of what we would like to see with resonance. So if you remember our basic setup for resonance, I guess I still have my slinky here. Imagine that. I could show you that again. Remember, we have a loudspeaker at one end. This, if you think about it in terms of a closed tube, we have a loudspeaker at one end, and then if you put a pressure pulse through the system. Then it will bounce back and forth, heading to, say, the far end of the tube, then coming back. And if we want to get a standing wave, we kind of have to reinforce it so that that pattern is able to sort of repeat over time without losing energy. The damping is sort of a precursor to all that. And you can see it actually quite nicely in this slinky, because damping is what happens when you just do it once. So I can just do that once, and it'll bounce back for a while, and then it'll kind of just peter out because we're losing some energy to like the externals of the system. It doesn't get a perfect bounce on the far end every time. It loses some energy to just my hand, and vice versa on the other side. And it's not a perfectly elastic coil, all these sorts of things. I've got a phone call. I'm probably going to have to handle that. Give me a second. I'll be back.